The Scarja had watched humanity for centuries, carefully noting its weaknesses and preparing for the moment they'd strike. In their eyes, humans were frail and divided, a species that could barely manage its own conflicts, let alone resist an intergalactic invasion. When the day finally came, they moved swiftly and decisively. With their technology far beyond anything Earth had ever seen, the invasion was over almost before it began. They decimated Earth's defenses in days. First, the satellites went dark, followed by global communication systems, leaving the entire planet isolated. Then came the waves of destruction. The Scarja obliterated Earth's cities with terrifying precision, reducing entire civilizations to ash. The few humans who survived fled underground or retreated to remote areas, but no place was safe for long. The Scarja hunted them down mercilessly. With humanity broken and scattered, the invaders turned their attention to a different kind of devastation. They targeted the lifeblood of Earth's people, literally. Blood banks were destroyed, medical facilities ransacked, and supply lines cut. It seemed like an odd strategy, but the Scarja understood that a weakened, malnourished population would make little effort to resist. It was an effective plan, at least on the surface. But they had miscalculated. Hidden deep within the shadows of society were those who depended on that very blood supply for their existence. Ancient, powerful vampires had long lived in secrecy among humans, feeding quietly and staying hidden to avoid detection. Their survival depended on a world where humans thrived and reproduced, where blood was plentiful. The Scarja's campaign to cut off Earth's blood supply didn't just affect humans, it was a direct attack on the vampires themselves. As the last remnants of human resistance struggled to survive, Commander Jansen found himself in an impossible situation. He had led the defense of Earth with everything he had, but it hadn't been enough. Now, with his forces reduced to scattered pockets of soldiers, he had no choice but to seek help from unlikely sources. That's when he discovered them, an ancient vampire clan, led by the enigmatic Lord Draven. Jansen had always thought vampires were a myth, but here they were, standing in front of him, more real than the aliens that had taken over his world. Draven, tall and imposing, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, laid out the truth. The Scarja's war had put the vampires in a dangerous position. Without a steady supply of human blood, they would starve. And if the humans went extinct, the vampires would follow. "We have a common enemy, Commander," Draven said, his voice as cold as the night. "But we cannot fight alone. Your people have what we need, and we have what you lack." It was a bitter realization, but Jansen knew Draven was right. The remaining human forces were exhausted, outgunned, and outnumbered. The vampires, on the other hand, were fast, nearly invulnerable, and possessed abilities that made them the perfect soldiers for this new war. But they needed blood, and in exchange for it, they would fight. The alliance was born out of necessity. The humans would provide the vampires with blood, and in return, the vampires would join the fight against the Scarja. It was an uneasy partnership, with tension running high on both sides. The humans feared what the vampires might do if they grew too strong, while the vampires had little trust in their new allies. But for now, survival took precedence over mistrust. The vampires had one condition: they would fight their way, not like the humans with their guns and brute force. They would strike in the dark, using stealth, speed, and fear to dismantle the alien invaders from within. And they were very good at it. The first strike came just as the Scarja were setting up a new base in the ruins of a once great city. The vampires descended on them like shadows, their movements too fast for the Scarja to detect. Draven led the charge, his eyes glowing in the dark as he tore through the alien soldiers with inhuman precision. His people followed, ripping through the Scarja ranks before they had a chance to react. The aliens had never faced anything like them. Jansen, watching from a distance with his remaining soldiers, was in awe. The Scarja, who had effortlessly crushed human forces, were now retreating in disarray, completely overwhelmed by the vampires' speed and ferocity. The vampires used their night vision to move unseen through the dark streets, turning the battlefield into a hunting ground. The aliens, with all their technology, were powerless against the ancient, primal power of the vampires. The first victory belonged to Earth, but it was just the beginning. For the vampires, this was more than a fight for survival. It was a reclamation of the night, a reminder to the invaders that Earth was not theirs for the taking. They fought with a level of brutality that shocked even the humans. Where humans saw war as a matter of strategy and defense, the vampires saw it as blood sport. The Scarja were not just enemies, they were prey. As the battle raged on, Commander Jansen began to see the potential of this alliance. With the vampires on their side, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance that they might actually win. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. The Scarja were smart, and they would adapt. The vampires were powerful, but not invincible. They had weaknesses, just like the humans did, and it was only a matter of time before the Scarja found them. For now, though, Earth had a fighting chance. The aliens thought they'd won, but they had underestimated the hidden power lurking in the shadows of the human world. As long as the vampires were willing to fight, and as long as the humans could keep supplying them with what they needed, there was still hope. But even in victory, Jansen couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was yet to come. The pact was sealed with quiet urgency, though neither side fully trusted the other. Commander Jansen understood that he needed the vampires' power, and Lord Draven knew that without human blood, his people were doomed. There was no room for hesitation, only survival. The Scarja had made the mistake of assuming Earth's defenses were all technology and military, but they hadn't accounted for the monsters that had walked among humans for centuries. The blood supply was reinstated, as much as they could manage. Draven's vampires were careful not to drain their human allies, but the tension was palpable. Every human soldier knew that without strict control, they could easily become food for the very beings who were now their allies. Yet, despite the unease, the humans kept their end of the bargain. Blood was drawn and given. In return, the vampires led the charge. The first planned strike was at a Scarja outpost deep in the ruins of an old industrial district. The Scarja had fortified it with their usual efficiency, but they had no defense against the vampires' speed and invisibility in the dark. The vampires moved like shadows, silent and deadly, their attacks precise and devastating. They slipped past alien guards, tearing through them before they even had a chance to sound the alarm. The few survivors were left confused, unsure of what had hit them. For the vampires, this kind of warfare was natural. Unlike human soldiers who relied on firepower, the vampires used their primal instincts, striking with terrifying efficiency. They didn't fight in the open, they hunted. It wasn't just about killing the Scarja, it was about breaking their morale, making them fear the night. The aliens had always been methodical in their conquests, using overwhelming force to subdue their enemies. But against the vampires, they were at a loss. Their energy weapons were useless when their targets moved too fast to be seen, and their advanced sensors couldn't detect creatures that had spent centuries perfecting the art of stealth. The Scarja, for all their technology, couldn't keep up. As Draven and his vampires wreaked havoc on the outposts, Jansen's human forces provided support from the shadows. They didn't engage directly but offered firepower where needed, helping to thin the ranks of any Scarja reinforcements. It was an unorthodox strategy, humans working as backup to vampires, but it worked. For the first time since the invasion began, Earth had the upper hand, even if only in the dark. After the attack, the vampires retreated, just as silently as they had arrived. The Scarja, left licking their wounds, were forced to reckon with the fact that their victory was not as secure as they had believed. They were beginning to fear something they couldn't understand, and that fear was exactly what Draven had wanted. In the aftermath of the raid, the alliance grew stronger, but the tension never fully dissipated. Vampires were not soldiers. They didn't follow human rules or military protocols. They fought with their own brutal efficiency, sometimes taking lives that humans would have spared. This led to friction, especially for Jansen, who had always viewed war as something to be fought with strategy and honor. The vampires, however, saw war as survival at any cost. The next target was a Scarja communication hub, one of the last operational centers that kept their forces connected across Earth. It was critical for the Scarja's continued coordination, and taking it out would cripple their ability to respond quickly. Draven knew it was heavily guarded, but that didn't concern him. His plan was simple: strike hard, strike fast, and leave nothing standing. As night fell, the vampires moved in. They swept through the Scarjaw defenses like a plague, destroying vital equipment and eliminating the alien guards with merciless precision. The vampires took their fill of blood from fallen Scarjaw soldiers, feeding their hunger and gaining strength for the battles ahead. Draven himself led the charge, his presence a constant, terrifying force on the battlefield. Jansen and his human forces watched from the sidelines, playing their part but never fully comfortable with the carnage. They respected the vampires' power, but they couldn't ignore the brutal, predatory nature of their allies. Jansen, especially, struggled with the morality of the situation. He knew the vampires were necessary, but he also knew that their thirst for blood made them dangerous, even to their human partners. As the vampires completed their mission and withdrew into the night, the Scarjaw were left in disarray. Their communication systems were destroyed, and their forces were scattered. For the first time since the invasion began, the Scarjaw were losing their grip on Earth. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give the humans and vampires hope. However, Jansen knew this was only the beginning. The Scarjaw wouldn't stay disorganized for long. They were too smart for that. They would adapt, just as they had done in every other conquest. And when they did, the vampires would need to be ready for a different kind of fight. The Scarjaw wouldn't make the same mistake twice. For now, though, the vampires had the advantage. They thrived in the darkness, where the Scarjaw couldn't reach them. And as long as the humans could provide the blood they needed, they would continue to fight. But Jansen couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile alliance was hanging by a thread. It was only a matter of time before the vampires' hunger outweighed their loyalty to the human cause. The victories were encouraging, but the war was far from over. The Scarjaw were already beginning to analyze their new enemy, trying to find a weakness they could exploit. And Jansen knew that once they did, the humans would once again be left vulnerable. The vampires could only do so much on their own, and without them, humanity had no chance of survival. As they prepared for the next strike, Jansen couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The Scarjaw were still out there, adapting, learning, and growing stronger. And while the vampires gave humanity a fighting chance, they also presented a new kind of danger, one that Jansen wasn't sure he could control. For now, though, the battle belonged to Earth's defenders. The Scarjaw thought they had won, but the vampires had proven them wrong. The Scarjaw weren't slow learners. They had taken their first real losses at the hands of creatures they hadn't even known existed. But that didn't mean they would be caught off guard again. They regrouped, studying the vampires and analyzing every piece of data they could collect from the attacks. It didn't take long for them to realize that the key to their enemy's power lay in the darkness. Their technology, advanced as it was, had always been designed to fight enemies that relied on the same conventional tactics, not against creatures that thrived in the shadows. But now, they had a new plan. It started with a shift in their tactics. The Scarjaw began to deploy ultraviolet light and heat-based weaponry. Entire sections of the battlefield were suddenly bathed in artificial sunlight, making it nearly impossible for the vampires to move undetected. Where the vampires had once stalked their prey with ease, they now found themselves exposed, vulnerable to weapons that could burn their flesh in seconds. The Scarjaw had finally found a weakness, and they were going to exploit it mercilessly. The initial counterattacks were devastating. The vampires, who had been untouchable in the early stages of the war, were suddenly losing ground. Younger vampires, less experienced and not as resilient as their elders, were incinerated by the new alien weapons. For the first time, the humans witnessed their supposed immortal allies being brought down, and it was a brutal reminder that even vampires had limits. Panic began to spread among the human ranks, as soldiers realized that their strongest allies were no longer invincible. The pressure on the alliance grew heavier with each passing day. The humans, desperate to hold on to the one advantage they had, struggled to find new ways to support the vampires, but there was only so much they could do. The vampires, on the other hand, were becoming more aggressive, demanding more blood to recover from their injuries and maintain their strength. Tensions that had simmered beneath the surface now began to boil over. Commander Jansen found himself caught in the middle of the growing conflict. He had always known that this alliance was fragile, but he hadn't expected it to fracture so quickly. The vampires, particularly Lord Draven, were becoming increasingly impatient with the humans' limitations. They needed more resources, more blood, more protection from the Skarja's new weapons. But Jansen didn't have the manpower or the supplies to meet their demands. The human forces were already stretched too thin, fighting to keep their remaining cities from falling completely into Skarja control. It wasn't long before the first cracks in the alliance began to show. A group of rogue vampires, led by an ambitious and ruthless lieutenant named Varric, started to question Draven's leadership. They believed the humans were holding them back, that they were wasting time trying to protect a species that was little more than cattle. Varric argued that the vampires should take what they needed, by force if necessary, and fight the Skarja on their own terms, without being tied down by human rules and strategies. Draven, for all his cold pragmatism, understood the value of the alliance. He knew that without human blood, his people would eventually weaken and die out. But Varric and his followers saw things differently. They didn't care about the long-term consequences. They wanted immediate power, immediate victory, and they weren't willing to wait for the humans to catch up. The divide between the vampires grew deeper, and Jansen, sensing the danger, tried to intervene. He approached Draven with a proposal to increase the blood supply, rationing it more effectively so that the vampires could regain their strength. But it wasn't enough. Draven, while still committed to the alliance, was starting to lose control over his own people. The more desperate they became, the less willing they were to follow his orders. Jansen's fears were confirmed during a failed raid on a Skarja forward base. The plan had been simple: strike at night, use the vampires to disable the enemy's defenses, and have the human forces sweep in to secure the area. But the Skarja had anticipated the move, flooding the battlefield with ultraviolet lights that left the vampires exposed. Varric, leading his own faction of rogue vampires, refused to retreat, pushing forward in a reckless attempt to break through the Skarja lines. The result was catastrophic. Varric's forces were decimated, and the survivors blamed Jansen for not providing enough support. They accused the humans of using the vampires as cannon fodder, of intentionally holding back resources to weaken their supposed allies. Draven, furious at the loss of his people, struggled to maintain control. Varric's influence was growing, and more vampires began to question whether the alliance with the humans was worth the cost. For Jansen, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The human forces couldn't afford to lose the vampires' support, but he couldn't ignore the growing threat of a full-blown rebellion within their ranks. He knew that if Varric continued to gain followers, the alliance would collapse, and without the vampires, Earth would be defenseless against the Skarja. To make matters worse, the Skarja were adapting faster than anyone had anticipated. Their new weapons were more effective with each battle, and they were developing ways to neutralize the vampires' powers even during night raids. The aliens had learned how to detect the vampires' movements, using thermal imaging and enhanced sensors that tracked the vampires' unique heat signatures. What had once been an easy slaughter for the vampires had now become a desperate fight for survival. Amidst all this, Jansen faced a difficult choice. He needed to find a way to restore balance between the humans and vampires before the alliance fractured beyond repair. Draven was still a powerful ally, but his grip on the vampire factions was weakening by the day. Varric was too dangerous to be left unchecked, but any move against him could lead to outright civil war among the vampires. As the Skarja continued to press their advantage, Jansen knew time was running out. The vampires had been Earth's greatest hope, but now they were on the brink of becoming its greatest threat. If the alliance fell apart, the Skarja would sweep over the planet with no resistance left to stop them. It was a race against time, and Jansen was running out of options. The final push from the Skarja was inevitable. They had adapted to the vampires' tactics, weaponizing ultraviolet light and heat to turn night into a battlefield of burning agony. Every raid cost more vampire lives than the last, and even the oldest of Draven's warriors were struggling to keep pace. The once unstoppable creatures of the night were now forced into hiding, clinging to whatever shadows they could find, while the humans fought desperately to protect their last strongholds. Jansen knew they were running out of time. The Scarja were preparing for an all-out assault, aimed at Earth's last bastion of human resistance. If the vampires and humans couldn't strike first, the final hope for Earth would be extinguished. Jansen gathered what remained of his command, trying to rally his troops, but the morale was low. Every soldier knew the odds were against them, and the vampires were no longer the impenetrable shield they once believed them to be. Draven, though weakened, was not one to accept defeat easily. He approached Jansen with a plan, an all-or-nothing gambit. While the humans held the line at the stronghold, Draven's vampires would launch a direct assault on the Scarja mothership. It was a suicide mission, but if they could sabotage the command center, they might just be able to throw the Scarja forces into chaos long enough for the humans to turn the tide. Jansen knew the risks. He also knew that without this desperate gamble, they would all die anyway. The Scarja had learned too much, adapted too well. Their only chance now was to strike at the heart of the invasion, crippling the command structure that kept the alien forces coordinated. With no other options, he agreed to Draven's plan. The preparations were swift. Jansen's human forces would make a stand at the stronghold, using every last bit of firepower they had to slow down the Scarja ground forces. Draven, along with a hand-picked team of his strongest remaining vampires, would infiltrate the mothership under the cover of night. They knew the risks. The Scarja had fortified their defenses with ultraviolet lights, but the vampires would have to move faster and strike harder than ever before. The night of the assault came quickly. The Scarja attacked the human stronghold with overwhelming force, just as Jansen had predicted. It was a bloodbath. The humans fought valiantly, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. The Scarja's advanced weaponry tore through their ranks, and Jansen's men began to fall one by one. But they held the line, just as they had promised. Every second they delayed the Scarja was a second that Draven and his vampires needed to complete their mission. Draven led his team through the outer defenses of the mothership with brutal efficiency. They moved like shadows, tearing through the Scarja guards before they could sound the alarm. But the further they pushed, the more dangerous it became. The Scarja had expected something like this, and their traps were designed to exploit the vampires' weaknesses. Ultraviolet lights flooded the hallways, and heat sensors tracked their every movement. Draven's team took heavy losses, but they pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that this was their only chance. At the stronghold, Jansen watched as his forces were decimated. The Scarja were relentless, but so were the humans. They used every last bullet, every last bit of artillery, to slow the alien advance. Jansen fought alongside his men, knowing full well that this could be his final stand. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Inside the mothership, Draven and his remaining warriors reached the command center. The Scarja commander, an imposing figure with advanced armor and weaponry, stood waiting. This wasn't just another fight. This was the heart of the invasion. Draven knew that killing the commander wouldn't end the war, but it would cripple the Scarja forces long enough for the humans to regroup. The battle was fierce. Draven's strength was waning, but his resolve had never been stronger. He fought with the fury of a creature that had lived for centuries, his every move precise and deadly. But the Scarja commander was no ordinary foe. He had studied the vampires, knew their weaknesses, and exploited them mercilessly. Draven's team was wiped out, one by one, until only he remained. Jansen's forces were on the brink of collapse. The Scarja had breached the final defenses, and the stronghold was falling. But even as the aliens pressed forward, Jansen refused to retreat. He could only hope that Draven had succeeded, that the vampires had done enough to disrupt the Scarja command. In the final moments of the battle aboard the mothership, Draven faced the Scarja commander in a one-on-one duel. It was a brutal, bloody fight, but Draven had one advantage the Scarja couldn't counter: centuries of experience in combat. He used every ounce of his remaining strength to exploit the smallest openings, striking with the precision of a predator. In the end, it was enough. Draven delivered the killing blow, tearing through the commander's defenses and leaving him lifeless on the floor of the command center. The effect was immediate. With their commander dead, the Skarja forces began to falter. Their communications were disrupted, their coordination shattered. The aliens at the stronghold, once an unstoppable force, suddenly hesitated. Jansen's forces seized the opportunity, launching a desperate counterattack that pushed the Skarja back. But the victory came at a great cost. Draven had barely survived the battle aboard the mothership. His strength was gone, and the vampires who had once been Earth's greatest weapon were all but decimated. Jansen's forces had suffered heavy casualties, and the stronghold lay in ruins. Yet, against all odds, they had won. The Skarja, leaderless and disorganized, retreated from Earth. The invasion had been stopped, but at a terrible price. The alliance between humans and vampires had held, but only just. And as Jansen looked out over the battlefield, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The vampires had proven themselves to be Earth's greatest protectors, but they were also a dangerous, unpredictable force. The war was over, but the fragile peace that followed was uncertain. Draven, weakened but alive, approached Jansen. There was no celebration, no victory speech. They had survived, but the cost had been immense. Jansen knew that while the Skarja were defeated, the vampires' hunger for blood had not been sated. The uneasy alliance that had saved Earth could just as easily turn into the next great threat. For now, though, Earth was safe. The Skarja had thought they'd won, but they had underestimated the darkness that had long protected this world. And as long as the vampires were willing to fight, humanity still had a chance.